I'm Rick, and this is Talk Tonic here at Retail Now 2024. I'm joined today by Dan Brattland, who it's going to take me a minute here because he has a couple of titles. He's currently president of CoCard. He's also president of his own independent dealership, EPS, in Minnesota. Dan, thanks for being here today.
Pleasure to be here.
Always great to spend time with you. I'm going to go back to a little bit in the Wayback Machine here and back to when I first met you, right? I first met you when I was a dinerware dealer and I was scaling my business, and in came this guy from Minnesota who sold 100 sites in his first year, right? And what I want to get to a little bit as we get through this is talking a little bit about sales and about success and all of that, because I know you're big on that. But tell me how you got kind of started in that world and how you sold so quickly and ramped up on a new product at that time.
Well, luckily, I learned certain business practices at a very young age. When I was in high school, I had a decision to make. I had some learning disabilities, dyslexia, and some other ADD and some stuff. I knew the traditional route of going to college and getting a degree and following it wasn't going to be my route. So I had a choice to either become a laborer, or luckily I found personal and professional development. I remember I picked up a book called The Power of Positive Thinking in a library one time, and I said, wow, this is good stuff. I was attracted to that industry, the personal and professional development, and I actually ended up starting a company called Peak Performance International when I was 19 years old. And we sold tickets to go see. I would hire big name speakers, Lou Holtz and Zig Ziglar and Brian Tracy and Tony Robbins. I did Tony Robbins' first Firewalk. And I was like a rock concert promoter for business people. I'd go into cities, and growing up in Minnesota, people think of Minnesota like it's Siberia in the wintertime. We play hockey. In my backyard, we'd water the grass, we'd play hockey. And I figured there had to be other better places to live. So I would travel from one city to another promoting a big seminar. It took me about 3 months. I'd fill up a room and I'd make money. Sometimes I wouldn't make money. But I really figured out after a period of time that a recurring revenue is I was only as good as my last seminar. And what I liked about that business is I got to sit in the back of the room and listen to all these great speakers and mentors and business, experts. And it really got, I ran my business, my seminar business. I learned all these business practices that I apply today in this business. When you say, how did you sell 100 sites in a year? It's just all this stuff I learned on how to lead, leadership skills, how to sell. I have a certain sales model that I use in every product and service I sell. It doesn't change. I have an 8-step process. I break the sales cycle up. But going back to traveling from city to city and learning the rest of the country and meeting people, I knew that eventually this business, I started videotaping these seminars, and I created the first online license library where we would license this content to businesses. And that's when I got the taste of recurring revenue. I sold that business in 1999, not enough to retire. I thought it was, but evidently not. So I had to find a new industry. And I met somebody at a show in Chicago. I go, I'm going to go to this Midwestern Acquirers Conference in Chicago. I heard about this whole payment business. I liked the recurring revenue stream. And I met someone who just started CoCard. So I go, well, I'd like to get in this business. So that's how it all started. And I used the same business practices for the first 10 years. And then I said, well, I've got to get into the software side of the business. You see, Rick, back about over a decade ago, you had the payment side of the business and you had the software side of the business. It was kind of like the jocks versus the geeks. Okay. And, the software guys, they didn't like the credit card guys.
I was the software guy.
Yeah, they're those dirty, rotten scoundrels. I don't even want to be I don't want my merchants, even my customers, to know I'm associated with any of those payment guys. The payment guys, they don't like those POS guys. Those they think they're the smartest guys in the room, and So, luckily I was able to figure out if I don't get involved in the software side, I'm going to kind of survive on the payment side.
Right.
And the software guys figured out if I don't get involved on the payment side, I'm not going to survive on the software. So there's this convergence. And fortunate enough, I got involved with, and that's when I met you at Dinerware. I called around. I go, I need a product. I found Dinerware. I'm in Minnesota. I need to, hey, we have an open territory. So that landed me with Dinerware. And then I applied some of those same business practices as I applied in all my various businesses that worked for that. So that's kind of how we brought me up to where we met in Seattle.
Right. And, to me, that was the interesting thing. When you came into that channel, I truly was the geek, right? I was an MCSE, self-trained, learned technology, worked in Fortune 50 companies with, 700 servers and 1,500, 2,000 desktops. My side of things was technology. People had told me, I think you have the gift to sell. And I said, that's not me. I'm a tech guy, right? Going back to my time in those big businesses, I remember thinking, man, if they would just get rid of the salespeople, this place would be a much better place, right? And then I thought, I got into my own business and I thought, maybe the building wouldn't be here without those salespeople.
That's right.
And so I quickly had to figure out how to sell. And thankfully, a lot of it came naturally to me, but I was smart enough to say to myself, maybe I was dumb enough to say to myself, I need to figure out how to do this. And the fastest way for me to do that was find successful people and understand what they do. And what I learned is, people like Dan Brattland are the most gracious people in the world, that they will just share that information with you. Before that, I had gotten into some of these public speakers and people who have written a lot of books. Brian Tracy, was a big fan of him. Of course, Zig Ziglar, Tom
Hopkins?
Tom Hopkins, wow. Huge.
He was my first mentor.
I love Tom Hopkins.
How to Master the Art of Selling Anything.
Yep. Tom Hopkins is great. I remember that it didn't really resonate with people. I would say to them, hey, who do you read? Because I wanted more. I wanted to expand my horizons. And people, I don't really read. I'm like, oh, okay. And so I then started asking people, every time. And then all of a sudden, here was Dan who said, do you know who Brian Tracy is? And I said, I'm a child of Brian Tracy. And so I said, there's this guy reads a lot of business books, motivational stuff. He must be a nerd. I don't know why he's buying into all this stuff. But the people who were saying that, they weren't exactly successful, right?
Right.
And I'm looking at people like Dan who were very successful. And so that led to, to this day, I constantly read business books, motivational business books, those kind of things. I went so far as to a bunch of years ago, I created my own personal success board of directors. It's on my wall. You're on there. Hey, I put you on the spot. You're on there.
Thank you.
Right?
Well, Rick, you mentioned something that I learned from way back. I forget from who, but I picked it up. And it was the easiest way to succeed in a business. And when I knew nothing about software, I'm not a tech guy. You're gifted because I consider you to be a jock and a geek. You can do it both. I technical side, I still don't know much about software, but what I did know is when I talked to Rob Freitag at Dinerware, I said, who is your number one dealer? And he said, well, it's this guy named Hunter Allen. I go, well, give me his number. And I called him because the one thing I learned, Rick, is that successful people, if you ask them what their secrets to success are, they're not afraid to tell you, which I find kind of fascinating. And that's why now the position I'm in now, I love giving any secrets I have in a very secretive business. The more successful you are, the more willing I found, the more willing you to share information.
Yes.
So what I learned was figure out what the people in your business, in your space, who are the most successful. Find out what it is they're doing. And the best way to do it is to ask, take them to lunch, fly to their city. I flew out, and when I got into CoCard, and I didn't know anything about credit cards. I didn't know what interchange was. It took me 2 years to even know what interchange is. And I figured out who the top office is in the country with CoCard, and I flew out, and I spent 2 days with them, and do what they do, and you will become successful too.
Right.
So all the things in my business now, when I present a point of sale software, it went from selling point of sale to a SaaS model, a PaaS model. Now we're into free point of sale if you do dual pricing. And now we're almost going to have to write a check, and I'll pay you, Mr. Merchant, if you process to me. So your business has to evolve too. And the best way to do it is to see who's doing it, who is successful, and model that.
Yeah, success in sales is replicable, right?
Yes.
That's what it is. Another point here, as we talk about famous authors, I remember in my early days of my business, I was winging it, right? And at some point, somebody said, "Hey, read this book," and it was The E-Myth by Michael Gerber, right?
Great book.
And I'm reading this thing, and I'm going, "Did somebody have a camera over my shoulder for the past 6 years? Like, here's all the mistakes that technical people make when they start a business." And Michael Gerber says, technical doesn't mean what you think it means. If you bake cookies, that's technical. If you make widgets, that's technical. And so I thought he lost me about halfway through the book when he said, you have to run your business as if it's a franchise. There's a reason a Big Mac tastes the same in Frankfurt, in Chicago, in Japan, right? And I thought, this doesn't really speak to me because I'm selling somebody else's intellectual property and I'm not going to be able to franchise that across the world. And then it hit me. I need to have my processes down. And so that when somebody comes into the business, I can hand them a book and say, you're going to go through training, but everything's documented here. And that was like a game changer to my business. Follow up to that, in 2015, the RSPA had Michael Gerber as the speaker in Nashville. And so kind of got to meet my idol after all those years.
Yeah. And I know Michael, and I worked with Michael, and when I talk about processes and sales, which I break the sales cycle into different aspects. There's a different skill set when it comes to prospecting and setting appointments than there is when it comes to building trust, credibility, relationships, presentation skills, overcoming objections, and closing the sale. There's a different skill set in managing the business, installation, service, and support. So whatever business I had, I would break that selling cycle up, and I would have specialists. And even Oracle, if you look at the big companies now, they call them BDRs. They get them right out of business school. What do? They're on the phones, they're prospecting, they're setting up demos. And then you have specialists that do the demos. And then you have somebody else that do the implementation. That's not a new concept. But within that concept, you have to have the processes. For instance, my presenters that do the demos, I have 8 steps. Number 1 is you have to build credibility. How do you build credibility? Before you start asking questions to them, and I script it out. And we videotape. And every one of our sales reps follow the same presentation, word for word pretty much, every single time. And I have salespeople who've been with me for 10 years. And today they go in, and the first paragraph is no different than it was 10 years ago. Then you go into asking questions. Step number 2, finding out what their pain is, figure out what they're doing, how can you help, asking those right questions. Then you do the hot buttons, I call them. Then you do your demo. Then you ask the trial close. A lot of sales representatives will do this beautiful presentation, and when they're finished, you'll say, well, what do you think? They'll say, it's great.
Can I follow up with you in a week?
Rick, this sounds great. Give me a call next week.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk it over with my partners. No, there's so many great presenters out there.
Right.
But if you don't, right after your demo, ask what I call a trial close that I learned from Tom Hopkins 30 years ago.
This is my pen and this is my paper.
From what you see here so far, can you see how this could be a benefit to your business? And if they don't say yes to that, you need to run out of there like you'd run out of a hot burning house.
Right.
So there's a process. And what's nice about that process I just went through is that when you hire someone to sell your product or service, and they do all their own prospecting, setting up appointments, presenting, closing, and even some of them do their installation and training, what happens when that person leaves your organization? You're in trouble.
In my early days in hospitality with Dinerware, I had somebody who basically could do all of that. And the problem I had was when he was implementing and training, the pipeline was going to nothing because he wasn't out there prospecting.
Exactly.
Right? You've got to keep that machine going and keep feeding things through it, that funnel.
You're too dependent on that person.
Yeah.
That person owns you. Versus if you have specialists, you can just plug people in. It didn't matter if, for whatever reason, I lost somebody within that, whether it be the prospecting, setting appointments, or presenting closers. I could slip somebody else in there, follow this process, and I never look for people who even had experience in the business.
Right.
I would rather take somebody with no experience in the business and teach them this process and follow this process. So that's been the secret to, I consider, my success in the various, whether it be on the payment side or the software side. And when I look at the top offices in CoCard, we have over 100 of them. they all have similar processes in place. And going back to your books, I was not a great reader, remember. I was listening to audio cassettes back then.
Right.
I turned my car into a university on wheels. I spent so much time making sales calls, traveling the country, like I said, from city to city, literally hours of windshield time, rather than listen to sports radio, which I know you probably listen to, or Rush Limbaugh back then, or whatever it is. I would listen to audio cassettes, which now could be podcasts. There's so much information you can listen to now of value.
I learned the University on Wheels pretty early on, and thankfully, I was right at the edge of that technology where it could be Audible, right? So Audible was in its early stages when I was early in my company. And so I did the purchasing. So I have 450 Audible books.
Yeah, now it's books on, you just listen to them while you're driving. I don't go home after a hard day's work and sit in my room or in my library or whatever and listen to personal development information. No, I want to watch ESPN and I want to watch the Olympics or some TV or something. That's not when you do it. It's when you drive to work in the morning or you're going on an appointment. It's when you're in your car during the workday. That's when you take in information.
Or habit stacking. So I ride a bicycle a lot and I have a little speaker on
when
there.
You're working out or riding a bike.
It's great. We could go on here all day, and you've just gotten a ton, an absolute ton of great information from Dan here. I thank you, as always, for being willing to share. This is what the RSPA is all about. But, you know, honestly, if you want to make yourself better in sales, in anything you do, learn.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you for having me, Rick.
Thank you,
Appreciate
Dan.
it.
Always a pleasure.
You bet. Thank you.